The headlights haunted me for 300 miles. No matter how fast I drove or how many exits I took, they were always there, hanging in my rearview mirror like a pair of relentless eyes. It started as an ordinary haul. I'd left Tucson just after sunset, my rig loaded with electronics bound for Dallas. The desert night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. I settled in for the long drive, my thermos full of coffee and my favorite country station playing low on the radio. I first noticed the car about an hour into my trip, just a pair of headlights in the distance, nothing unusual. But as the miles rolled by, I realized it was keeping pace with me. Not tailgating, just there. Always there. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of folks drive long distances at night. Maybe they were headed to the same general area. But a gnawing unease began to grow in my gut as we passed the state line into New Mexico. I'm not usually the paranoid type. 20 years on the road teaches you to keep a level head. But something about this car set my teeth on edge. It never got too close, never tried to pass, just followed, silent and persistent, like a shadow you can't shake. I tried to get a better look when we passed through well-lit areas, but the glare of the headlights made it impossible to make out any details. Was it a cop? An unmarked car, maybe? But why would they follow for so long without pulling me over? As we approached Lordsburg, I decided to test my theory. I signaled and took the exit, pulling into a truck stop just off the highway. The lights followed. My hands were sweating on the wheel as I navigated the parking lot, finally choosing a spot near the back, away from the other trucks. I killed the engine but left the cabin lights off. Then I waited, watching in my side mirror. The car pulled in slowly, cruising past the gas pumps. It was an older model sedan, dark-colored. I couldn't make out the driver. It rolled to a stop about 50 feet behind my trailer. My heart was pounding now. This was no coincidence. Whoever was in that car was following me, no doubt about it. But why? I ran through possibilities in my mind, each one worse than the last. Was I being set up for a hijacking? Had I unknowingly picked up some kind of contraband back in Tucson? I reached for my cell phone with shaking hands, ready to call 911. But what would I say? I wasn't even sure a crime had been committed. Before I could dial, the car's headlights flicked off. I held my breath, waiting. A long minute passed, then another. The car door opened. I should have started the engine, should have gotten the hell out of there. But a mix of fear and morbid curiosity held me in place. I watched as a figure emerged from the car, tall, broad-shouldered, definitely a man. He stood there for a moment, then began walking towards my truck. Panic surged through me. I fumbled with my keys, trying to get them into the ignition. But my hands were shaking so bad I dropped them. As I bent to retrieve them from the floor, I heard a tap on my window. I froze. The tap came again, more insistent this time. Slowly, I raised my head. The man was standing right outside my door. He wore a dark jacket, hood pulled up despite the mild night. I couldn't make out his face in the shadows. He raised his hand, gesturing for me to roll down the window. Every instinct screamed at me to drive away. But I was boxed in, other trucks on both sides. There was nowhere to go. With my heart in my throat, I hit the button to lower the window a crack. "Can I help you?" I managed to croak out. The man leaned in close. I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke and something else, something chemical. When he spoke, his voice was low and gravelly. "You've got something that belongs to me, friend." I blinked, confusion momentarily overriding my fear. "What? I don't know what you're talking about." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Playing dumb won't help you. I know it's in your truck. Hand it over, nice and easy, and we can both be on our way." My mind raced. What the hell was he talking about? I'd picked up my load from a reputable warehouse. Everything had seemed on the up and up. "Look, mister, I think you've got the wrong truck. I'm just hauling electronics. Nothing else." The man's hand shot through the gap in the window, grabbing my shirt. He pulled me close, his face inches from mine. I could see his eyes now, bloodshot and wild. "Don't lie to me," he snarled. "I followed that shipment from Tucson. I know exactly what's hidden in those crates. Now you can give it to me and drive away, or things are going to get real unpleasant." Your choice. Terror clawed at my throat. This guy was clearly unstable, possibly on drugs, and he was convinced I had something valuable. Even if I convinced him I was clueless, he might hurt me just out of frustration. I needed to buy time, to think. Okay, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Just let me get out of the cab. Whatever you're looking for, it'd be in the trailer. He released my shirt, stepping back. Fine, but no funny business. I've got friends watching. You try to run, you won't make it 10 feet. I nodded, slowly opening the door. As I climbed down, I scanned the parking lot. There were a few other trucks around, but I didn't see anyone else. Was he bluffing about having backup? Lead the way, he growled, giving me a shove towards the back of the trailer. My mind raced as we walked. I had no idea what this guy thought was in my cargo, but I knew opening the trailer would only prove I was telling the truth, and somehow, I didn't think he'd take that news well. We reached the rear doors. I fumbled with the keys, stalling for time. Look, I don't know what you think is in here, but I swear to you it's just electronics. TVs, computers, that kind of thing. Open it, he snapped, ignoring my protests. Just then, I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye. A police cruiser was pulling into the truck stop, probably just making routine rounds. It was now or never. I turned to face the man, keeping my voice low. Last chance. Walk away now or I start yelling. That cop over there will be awful interested in why you're threatening me. His eyes widened, darting towards the patrol car. For a moment I thought he might attack me anyway, but then he took a step back, his face twisting with rage. This isn't over, he hissed. I'll find you on the road, when you least expect it. Sleep tight, driver. With that, he turned and jogged back to his car. I sagged against the trailer, my legs weak with relief. I watched as he peeled out of the parking lot, disappearing into the night. It took me a few minutes to stop shaking. I thought about reporting the incident, but decided against it. I had no real proof, and something told me it would only complicate things. I climbed back into my cab on unsteady legs, my mind whirling. What the hell had just happened? Was there really something hidden in my cargo? Or was this just the delusion of a desperate man? Part of me wanted to open the trailer, to check every crate and corner, but a larger part knew that was a bad idea. If there was something illegal in there, I didn't want to know about it. Plausible deniability and all that. I sat there for a long time, debating what to do. In the end, I decided to complete my run. I'd deliver the cargo as planned, and hope that whatever the man thought was in there, he was mistaken. It was a risk, but less of one than abandoning a load in the middle of nowhere. As I pulled back onto the highway, my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. Every set of headlights made my heart race. His parting words echoed in my mind. I'll find you on the road, when you least expect it. The long night stretched ahead of me, full of shadows and uncertainty. One thing was for sure. This was a run I'd never forget. And as the miles rolled by, I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, some way, I hadn't seen the last of that mysterious car and its dangerous driver. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. Just like that, I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but miles of empty road ahead and behind me. Little did I know, my real nightmare was about to begin. I'd been on the road for nearly 14 hours, pushing to make a deadline. The sun had set hours ago, leaving me alone with the hum of tires on asphalt and the glow of my dashboard. I was somewhere in eastern Oregon, surrounded by dense forest and rolling hills, the kind of place where you can drive for an hour without seeing another soul. When my truck started acting up, I figured it was just fatigue. Maybe I needed a coffee break. But then the engine light flicked on, and before I could even think about pulling over, the whole rig went dead. I coasted to a stop on the narrow shoulder, the sudden silence deafening. "Come on, baby," I muttered, trying the ignition. Nothing, not even a click. I slumped back in my seat, frustration washing over me. I'd had breakdowns before, but never somewhere this remote. I reached for my phone, already knowing what I'd see. No signal, of course. I was in a dead zone, miles from the nearest town. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. Panic wouldn't help. I needed a plan. The smart move would be to stay with the truck, wait for another vehicle to pass. but who knew how long that could take? And my deadline was ticking away with every passing minute. The cargo I was hauling was time-sensitive. If I didn't make it to Portland by morning, I'd lose the contract. And I couldn't afford that, not with the bills piling up at home. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket, then climbed down from the cab. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I swept the beam of light over my truck, hoping to spot an obvious problem. But everything looked normal, at least to my untrained eye. With a sigh, I made my decision. I'd walk, find help, or at least a spot with cell service. I could be back in a couple of hours if I was lucky. I pocketed my phone, made sure the truck was locked up tight, and started down the road. The first mile wasn't so bad. The moon was bright, casting everything in a silvery glow. My footsteps crunched on the gravel shoulder, the sound oddly comforting in the stillness. I kept my flashlight pointed at the ground, saving the battery in case I needed it later. But as I walked, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. It was quiet, too quiet. No crickets chirping, no rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more and more, though I couldn't say why. That's when I heard it. A crack, like a branch snapping, somewhere in the woods to my right. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding. Probably just an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I picked up my pace, no longer trying to conserve energy. Whatever was in those woods, I didn't want to meet it. The sounds continued, sometimes to my right, sometimes to my left, always just out of sight, hidden by the thick trees. My walk became a jog, then a run. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air. I was no longer thinking about finding help or making my deadline. All I wanted was to get back to my truck, to the relative safety of its sturdy walls. But when I rounded a bend in the road, my blood ran cold. There, about 100 yards ahead, was a figure, just standing there in the middle of the road, motionless. The moonlight didn't reach that far, leaving it as nothing more than a dark silhouette. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to even breathe. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I took a tentative step forward, then another. As I got closer, details began to emerge. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and thin, impossibly thin. Its arms hung at its sides, nearly touching the ground. 20 yards away now, close enough to see that what I had thought was clothing was actually fur. Dark, matted fur that covered its entire body. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. I must have fallen asleep at the wheel. This was a dream, a nightmare. Suddenly, the thing's head snapped towards me. I caught a glimpse of gleaming eyes, a mouth full of sharp teeth. A low growl rumbled through the air, raising the hair on the back of my neck. I ran, faster than I've ever run in my life, back the way I had come, towards my truck. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush. The sound of snapping branches and that terrible growl spurring me on. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I rounded another bend, and there, like a beacon of hope, was my truck. I fumbled for my keys as I ran, praying I wouldn't drop them. The thing was close now, so close I could hear its ragged breathing, feel the thud of its footsteps. I reached the driver's side door, my shaking hands struggling with the lock. Come on, I muttered, finally managing to wrench the door open. I threw myself inside, slamming it shut just as a massive form slammed into the side of the truck. The whole rig rocked with the impact. I scrambled to lock the doors, then sat there, paralyzed with fear. Outside, the creature circled the truck. I could hear its claws scraping against the metal, see flashes of its hulking form as it passed the windows. Minutes passed like hours. I don't know how long I sat there, barely breathing, waiting for it to break through the glass or tear off the door. But gradually the sounds faded. The scratching stopped. Silence fell once again. Dawn was breaking by the time I worked up the courage to peer out the window. The road was empty. Whatever had chased me was gone, leaving no trace it had ever been there. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, I began to doubt my own memory. Had it all been a stress-induced hallucination? I was startled by a knock on my window. I yelped, nearly jumping out of my skin, before realizing it was a state trooper. He'd spotted my truck and stopped to help. "Everything all right, sir-y?" he asked as I rolled down the window, his face creased with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth, then closed it. How could I explain what had happened? He'd think I was crazy or drunk. Hell, maybe I was crazy. Just engine trouble," I managed to say. "Been a long night?" The trooper nodded sympathetically. "Let's take a look, shall we? We'll get you back on the road in no time." As he moved to the front of the truck, I stepped out on shaky legs. The morning was bright and clear, the horrors of the night seeming impossible in the light of day. But as I moved to join the trooper, something caught my eye. There, on the side of my truck, were 3 long, deep scratches in the metal. Scratches that hadn't been there the day before. Scratches that no animal I knew of could have made. I swallowed hard, a chill running down my spine despite the warming day. Whatever I had encountered last night, whatever had chased me through the darkness, it had been real. And somewhere out there, in the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest, it was waiting. As the trooper worked on my engine, I found myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a pair of gleaming eyes staring back at me. I knew one thing for certain. Once my truck was fixed, I was getting the hell out of there. And I'd never drive this stretch of road at night again. Some things, I realized, are better left in the darkness where they belong. And some nights on the road are better left forgotten. The container was supposed to be silent, sealed, safe. But as I barreled down the midnight highway, the muffled thumps and scratches from inside told a different story, one that made my blood run cold. It had started as a routine job, or so I thought, a chance to make some extra cash on a cross-country haul. The client was offering double my usual rate for a discreet transport from Los Angeles to New York. No questions asked, no inspection required, just pick up, drive, and deliver. Simple. I should have known better. In my 15 years on the road, I'd learned that nothing that paid that well ever came without strings. But with my daughter's college tuition looming and the transmission on my rig about to give out, I was in no position to turn down good money. The pickup went smoothly enough. A nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of LA, staffed by men in plain clothes who avoided eye contact. They loaded a single container onto my flatbed, secured it tight, and sent me on my way with nothing but a delivery address and a stern warning. Don't stop unless absolutely necessary. Don't open the container. Don't talk about the job. For the first day, it was easy. Just me, the open road, and the hum of my engine. I even started to relax, thinking maybe I'd lucked into an easy payday after all. But as I crossed into Arizona, things changed. It started with a sound so faint I thought I was imagining it. A soft thud, like something shifting inside the container. I turned down my radio, straining to listen. Nothing. Just as I was about to shrug it off, I heard it again. Louder this time. Unmistakable. My hands tightened on the wheel. It could be anything, I told myself. Poorly secured cargo. An animal that had snuck in somehow. But deep down, I knew, whatever was in that container, it was alive. And it wasn't happy. I wrestled with what to do. The smart move would be to pull over, call the client, maybe even the cops. But the warning echoed in my head. Don't stop. Don't open it. The implication was clear. Doing either would be bad for my health. So I kept driving, trying to ignore the increasingly frequent noises from behind me. Scratches, thumps, and once, I swear, what sounded like a muffled cry. By the time I hit New Mexico, I was a nervous wreck. Every bump in the road made me flinch, wondering if this would be the moment whatever was back there broke free. I hadn't slept in 36 hours, surviving on gas station coffee and the cold sweat of fear. I needed to stop, to rest, to think, to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Against my better judgment, I pulled into a rest area just east of Albuquerque. It was nearly 3 a.m., The place deserted except for a couple of other trucks whose drivers were likely asleep in their cabs. I killed the engine but left the keys in the ignition, just in case. Then I sat there, listening. For several long minutes, there was nothing. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it had all been in my head, I heard it. A distinct rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the inside of the container. My heart raced. This was my chance. To end this. To do the right thing. I could call for help. Put a stop to whatever illegal operation I'd gotten myself mixed up in. But as I reached for my phone, another sound froze me in place. Voices, coming from outside my truck. I peered out the window. 2 men were walking around my rig, flashlights in hand. They weren't dressed like cops or security, more like the guys who had loaded the container. My blood ran cold. Had they been following me this whole time? I slouched down in my seat, praying they hadn't seen me. The men circled the truck twice, pausing near the container each time. Then, apparently satisfied, they returned to a dark SUV parked nearby and drove off. I let out a shaky breath. This was bad, really bad. Whatever I was hauling, it was valuable enough to warrant a security detail, and dangerous enough to need constant monitoring. I was in way over my head. But what could I do? If I abandoned the job now, I'd not only lose the paycheck, but probably end up in a shallow grave somewhere in the desert. And if I went to the authorities, who's to say they weren't in on it too? As I sat there, paralyzed by indecision, the tapping from the container started again. But this time, it was different, deliberate, a pattern, ... .. My eyes widened as I recognized it. SOS. A universal cry for help, tapped out in Morse code. Whatever or whoever was in there, they were conscious, intelligent, and desperately trying to communicate. In that moment, I made my decision. I couldn't ignore this. Couldn't just drive away and pretend I didn't know something was terribly wrong. I had to look, had to know. With shaking hands, I grabbed my flashlight and tire iron. I climbed out of the cab, my eyes darting around the empty rest area. The night was silent, except for the distant hum of highway traffic and the faint tapping from the container. I approached cautiously, half expecting those men to reappear at any moment. When I reached the back of the container, I hesitated. This was it. The point of no return. Once I opened this, there would be no going back to blissful ignorance. I took a deep breath, steeled my nerves, and began working on the lock. It was heavy duty, but nothing my tire iron couldn't handle with a bit of leverage. After a few tense minutes, it gave way with a loud clank. I froze, certain the sound would bring those men running, but the rest area remained still. With trembling fingers, I grasped the handle and slowly pulled the door open. The smell hit me first. Sweat, fear, and something metallic. Blood? I raised my flashlight, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The beam illuminated a scene straight out of a nightmare. The container was lined with what looked like medical equipment, heart monitors, IV stands, and things I couldn't even name. And there, strapped to gurneys in the center, were people. 3 of them. They squinted in the sudden light, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. They were pale, thin, hooked up to various tubes and wires. One, a young woman, had fresh bruises on her arms. Another, an older man, was trembling uncontrollably. "Oh my God," I whispered, the full weight of the situation crashing down on me. This wasn't just smuggling. This was human trafficking, experimentation, something even worse. The young woman spoke, her voice hoarse. "Please, help us." I stood there, rooted to the spot. This was so far beyond anything I was equipped to handle. But I couldn't just close the door and drive away. Not now. Not knowing. I'll get you out, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. Just give me a minute to think. But before I could even begin to formulate a plan, headlights swept across the rest area. The SUV was back. Panic surged through me. I couldn't get them out in time. Couldn't risk being caught here. With a muttered apology that felt wholly inadequate, I closed the container door, leaving it unlocked. Then I sprinted back to my cab. I started the engine just as the SUV pulled up behind me. Heart racing, I pulled out of the rest area, trying to act normal. In my rearview mirror, I saw the men get out, heading towards the container. By now, they'd know it had been opened. As I emerged back onto the highway, my mind was in chaos. What could I do? Where could I go? The client would know I'd seen what I shouldn't have. There would be no safe delivery now, no easy payday, just danger at every turn. I thought about the people in the container, about what might happen to them and to me if I didn't act fast. I needed help, but who could I trust? With shaking hands, I reached for my phone. I couldn't call the local cops, couldn't risk them being paid off. No, I needed to go bigger, federal. As I scrolled through my contacts, a name caught my eye. An old Army buddy who now worked for the FBI. I hit dial, my eyes constantly checking the mirrors for any sign of pursuit. When he answered, groggy from sleep, I cut straight to the chase. Mike, it's Dave. Remember that favor you owe me? I need to cash it in, now. And I need you to listen carefully because people's lives depend on what I'm about to tell you. As I sped through the New Mexico night, the weight of the container behind me and the gravity of my situation pressing down, I knew nothing would ever be the same. My simple life as a trucker was over. But maybe, just maybe, I could do something good with its ending. Whatever happened next, I was all in. No turning back. The real journey was just beginning. The crunch of gravel under tires jolted me from my fitful sleep. One vehicle, then another. My eyes snapped open, heart racing as I peered through the darkness. 5 sets of headlights surrounded my truck, their beams cutting through the night like searchlights. This wasn't a chance encounter. They had come for me. I'd pulled into this rest stop just outside of Flagstaff around midnight, bone-tired after 14 hours on the road. It was one of those bare-bones places. Just a gravel lot, a couple of picnic tables, and a sad excuse for a bathroom. Not exactly 5-star accommodations, but it beat falling asleep at the wheel. Now, as I blinked away the fog of interrupted sleep, I cursed myself for choosing such an isolated spot. The nearest town was miles away, and at 3 a.m. there wasn't another soul around. Just me and whoever was in those vehicles. I held my breath, watching as doors opened and figures emerged. In the harsh glare of headlights, I could make out 6 people. All men, from what I could tell. They moved with purpose, spreading out to surround my rig. My mind raced. Was this a robbery? Some kind of trafficking operation? I'd heard stories from other drivers about crews that targeted truckers, stealing cargo or worse. But I was hauling nothing but pallets of cheap electronics. Hardly worth all this effort. One of the men approached my cab, his face hidden in shadow. He rapped on the door with something metallic, a gun? My mouth went dry. "Come on out, driver," he called, his voice gruff and impatient. "We need to have a chat." I weighed my options. I could try to start the engine and plow through them, but they had me boxed in tight. Even if I managed to get moving, those vehicles could easily run me down on the open road. Fighting wasn't an option either. Even if I had been the type, which I wasn't, I was outnumbered and likely outgunned. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," the man said, tapping the door again. "Out. Now." With trembling hands, I reached for the door handle. Whatever was about to happen, I figured my chances were better if I didn't piss them off right out of the gate. I pushed the door open slowly, raising my hands to show I wasn't armed. "Easy there, fellas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I climbed down from the cab. "I don't want any trouble." The man who'd called me out stepped back, giving me space to exit. Now that I was closer, I could see he was older, maybe in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair and deep lines etched into his face. He wore a dark jacket with some kind of patch on the sleeve, but I couldn't make out the design. "Trouble found you whether you want it or not," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "You're carrying something that doesn't belong to you." I blinked, confusion momentarily overriding my fear. "What? No, that's impossible. I picked up this load myself from the depot in LA. It's all above board, cheap tablets and laptops bound for Chicago." The man shook his head, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. "Not in your trailer. On you." My mind raced. What the hell was he talking about? I patted my pockets instinctively, feeling for anything out of place. There was nothing but my wallet, keys, and the burner phone I'd started carrying for emergencies. The phone. A chill ran down my spine as realization dawned. 3 days ago, at a truck stop outside of Barstow, a panicked woman had approached me. She'd spun a story about an abusive ex, begged me to hold on to a phone for her, said she'd arrange for someone to pick it up from me once I reached Chicago. Against my better judgment, I'd agreed. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time. The man must have seen the recognition in my eyes. He nodded grimly. That's right. Hand it over, nice and easy. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly bone dry. Look, I don't know what's on that phone, but I'm not part of whatever this is. Some lady asked me to hold it for her. That's all. One of the other men stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on a holstered weapon. You really expect us to believe you're just an innocent bystander? In our experience, there's no such thing. I raised my hands higher, panic rising in my chest. I swear, I'm just a driver. I don't know anything about... Enough, the older man cut me off. The phone, now, or things get unpleasant. With shaking hands, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burner phone. It looked so ordinary, so harmless. Hard to believe it was the cause of all this. As I held it out, the older man snatched it from my grasp. He turned it over in his hands, examining it closely before nodding to one of his companions. The other man produced some kind of device, which he ran over the phone. After a moment, it emitted a soft beep. It's clean, the man with the device said. No tracker. The older man grunted in acknowledgement, then turned his attention back to me. You say a woman gave this to you? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Describe her. I closed my eyes, trying to recall details through the haze of fear. Mid-30s maybe? Blonde hair, cut short, green eyes. She had a scar on her left cheek, just below the eye. The men exchanged glances. Something in their demeanor shifted, a tension I hadn't even realized was there easing slightly. Matches the description, one of them muttered. The older man studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. Seems you might be telling the truth after all, driver. But you've still seen and heard things you shouldn't have. My heart sank. This was it. They were going to kill me, dump my body in the desert. I'd be just another mysterious disappearance, my family left to wonder what had happened to me. But the man's next words surprised me. We're going to make you an offer, one time only. You work for us now. You'll carry packages, deliver messages, do as you're told, no questions asked. In return, you get to live, and you'll be well compensated for your trouble. I stared at him, stunned. And if I refuse? His expression hardened. Then we leave you out here in the desert with no truck, no phone, and no guarantee that someone else won't come looking for you. Someone who might not be as understanding as we are. It wasn't much of a choice. Images flashed through my mind. My daughter's college graduation, my son's little league games. Things I might never see if I said no. And who knew what these people were capable of? Would they go after my family if I refused? Okay, I heard myself say, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. I'll do it. The older man nodded, seeming unsurprised by my decision. Smart choice. We'll be in touch with your first assignment soon. For now, get back on the road. Deliver your current load as planned. And remember, we'll be watching. As quickly as they had appeared, the men retreated to their vehicles. Engines roared to life, and one by one they pulled away, leaving me alone in the darkness once more. I stood there for a long time, my legs weak, mind reeling from what had just transpired. In the space of 15 minutes, my entire life had changed. I was no longer just Dave Thompson, long-haul trucker. I was, what, a reluctant criminal? A pawn in some larger game I didn't understand? Eventually, I climbed back into my cab on unsteady legs. As I turned the key in the ignition, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. I looked older, somehow, haunted. I pulled back onto the empty highway, the familiar rumble of my rig offering little comfort. The open road had always represented freedom to me. Now it felt like a chain, binding me to whatever dark path lay ahead. As the miles rolled by, my mind churned with questions. Who were those men? What was on that phone? And what had I gotten myself into? One thing was certain. My days of being just another trucker were over. From now on, every load could be a test, every stranger a potential threat. I'd have to watch my every move, always looking over my shoulder. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as I crossed the state line into New Mexico. A new day dawning, but for me it felt like the beginning of a long, dark night. The glare of headlights cut through the swirling snow, illuminating a car teetering on the edge of disaster. I pulled my rig to a stop, ready to play the Good Samaritan. Little did I know I was about to drive straight into a trap of my own making. It was the kind of night that made me question my career choices. Mid-January in Montana, with a blizzard raging that would make a Yeti think twice about going out. But deadlines wait for no man, and I had a load of electronics to get to Seattle by morning. I'd been driving for hours, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as I navigated the treacherous mountain roads. The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see 20 feet in front of me. It was slow going, but I was making progress. That's when I saw it. A flash of red tail lights up ahead, spinning wildly before disappearing off the side of the road. My heart leapt into my throat. Someone had just gone off the edge. Without a second thought, I eased my rig to a stop on the shoulder. It wasn't safe, but I couldn't just drive by. What if someone was hurt? I grabbed my heavy coat and flashlight, then carefully made my way down the slope. The car had slid about 30 feet off the road, coming to rest against a sturdy pine tree. If not for that tree, they would have gone right over the cliff. As I approached, I could see someone moving inside, trying to open the driver's side door. "Hey!" I called out, my voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "You all right in there?" The door finally popped open, and a man stumbled out. He was younger than me, maybe in his early 30s, with dark hair plastered to his forehead from the snow. He looked dazed, but otherwise unharmed. "Thank God," he said as I reached him, relief evident in his voice. "I thought I was going to freeze to death out here." I gave him a quick once-over, checking for any obvious injuries. "Are you hurt? Anyone else in the car?" He shook his head. "No, just me, and I'm okay, I think. Just shaken up." I nodded, squinting through the snow at his car. It didn't look too badly damaged, but there was no way he was getting it back on the road without a tow truck. "Let's get you up to my truck," I said, gesturing back towards the road. "It's warmer there, and I've got a radio. We can call for help." The man nodded gratefully, and we began the slow climb back up to the highway. The wind was picking up, driving the snow horizontally into our faces. By the time we reached my rig, we were both covered in a layer of white. I helped him into the passenger seat, then climbed in myself, sighing with relief as I shut out the storm. I cranked up the heat and reached for the radio mic. "Hang on," the man said suddenly, his hand on my arm. "Before you call anyone, I need to tell you something." I turned to him, a flicker of unease in my gut. There was something in his eyes, a nervousness that hadn't been there before. "What is it?" I asked cautiously. He took a deep breath. "My name's not really important, but I'm in some trouble. The kind of trouble where I can't exactly have the cops or a tow truck showing up." My unease grew into full-blown alarm. What had I gotten myself into? "What kind of trouble?" I asked, my hand inching towards the door handle. He must have sensed my apprehension because he held up his hands in a placating gesture. "It's not what you think. I'm not dangerous or anything. It's just complicated." I didn't relax. "Complicated how?" He sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. "I used to work for a tech company, big one, you'd know the name. I found out they were doing some not-so-legal things. Selling user data, manipulating algorithms, that sort of thing. I couldn't just sit by and do nothing, you know?" I nodded slowly, still wary but listening. "So I gathered evidence. Lots of it. Enough to bring the whole company down if it got out. But they found out what I was doing. Now I'm on the run, trying to get this information to someone who can use it." It sounded like something out of a movie. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of a madman or a con artist, but there was a sincerity in his eyes that gave me pause. "That's quite a story," I said carefully. "But what does it have to do with me?" He leaned forward, his expression intense. "I need your help. I can't risk calling for official help, but I need to get to Seattle. That's where my contact is. If you could give me a ride. I shook my head immediately. No way. I'm not getting involved in whatever this is. I've got a job to do, deadlines to meet. Please, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. I know it's a lot to ask, but this is bigger than me. It's about holding powerful people accountable. Think of all the lives that could be affected if this information gets out. I sat back, conflicted. On one hand, every instinct was telling me to kick this guy out of my truck and drive away. It wasn't my problem, and getting involved could only lead to trouble. On the other hand, if what he was saying was true, could I really just turn my back? How do I know you're telling the truth? I asked. This could all be some elaborate scam. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a thumb drive. This is everything. All the evidence. You're welcome to look at it yourself if you want proof. I eyed the thumb drive warily. Did I really want to see what was on there? If I did, there'd be no going back. I'd be involved whether I wanted to be or not. As I debated, a new sound cut through the howling wind. Engines, coming our way. The man's eyes widened in panic. They found me, he whispered. I peered out the windshield. Through the swirling snow, I could make out headlights approaching. 2 vehicles moving fast. In that moment, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I started the engine. Hold on, I growled, throwing the rig into gear. The man looked at me in surprise. What are you doing? Getting us the hell out of here, I replied, easing back onto the road. I don't know if I believe your story or not, but I'm not about to let you get grabbed by whoever's in those cars. Relief washed over his face. Thank you. You have no idea what this means. I grunted in response, focusing on the treacherous road ahead. The vehicles behind us were gaining quickly. Whoever was driving them knew these roads better than I did. For the next hour, it was like something out of an action movie. Me, wrestling with my 18-wheeler on icy mountain roads. Our pursuers, relentless in their chase. The man beside me, alternating between giving directions and looking nervously out the rear window. We took turns I didn't know my rig could handle, skirted edges that made my stomach lurch. All the while, the storm raged around us, as if nature itself was trying to stop our escape. Finally, as we descended into a valley, we seemed to lose them. The headlights disappeared from my mirrors, swallowed by the storm. We drove in tense silence for a while, both of us waiting for the pursuit to resume. But as the miles ticked by and the storm began to ease, it became clear we had made it. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, the man turned to me. I don't know how to thank you, he said softly. You risked everything for a complete stranger. I shrugged, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over me. Yeah, well, seemed like the right thing to do. I just hope it was worth it. He nodded solemnly. It will be. Once this information gets out, it'll change everything. We lapsed into silence again as Seattle appeared on the horizon. I had 1,000 questions, but I wasn't sure I wanted the answers. Sometimes, it's better not to know too much. As I pulled into the city, the man directed me to a nondescript office building downtown. Before he got out, he turned to me one last time. I know you probably want to forget this ever happened, he said, but if you ever need anything at all, use this. He handed me a business card with nothing but a phone number on it. I took it wordlessly, watching as he disappeared into the building. Then I pointed my rig towards the depot, my original delivery now hours late. As I drove, my mind whirled with the events of the night. Had I done the right thing? Was his story even true? And what would happen now? One thing was certain. My life as a simple trucker was over. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Whatever came next, I had a feeling my quiet days on the open road were numbered. I fingered the business card in my pocket. A lifeline or a curse? Only time would tell. But as I navigated the busy Seattle streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much bigger journey.